Hello and a very warm welcome indeed to Quadriga, and this week we're taking a step back from the regular news agenda to discuss a theme that is too often neglected, the battle that is to end poverty and economic injustice. How can it be, for instance, that the richest 1% of humanity owns more than all the rest put together? The accumulation of wealth in the hands of just a few comes at a high price for countless millions of others who toil for a pittance and have little or no access to public health or education systems. As a result, more and more people are leaving their homelands and risking their lives to head for more prosperous countries like Germany. So, our question on Quadriga this week is fair trade, how unjust is the global economy? And to discuss that topic, I'm joined here in the studio by three astute observers and analysts, beginning with Mekonnen Mesghena, a specialist on migration and diversity with the Heinrich Böll Foundation. He says alongside war and bad governance, the inequality of opportunity in global markets is the main factor behind the global migration crisis. Also with us is Posener, commentator for the Berlin daily Die Welt. Alan believes that the main drivers of poverty and emigration are war, corruption, fragile states and bad leaders, and not unjust trade relations. And a warm welcome to Rajshri Jayaraman, a development economist at the European School of Management and Technology, or ESMT, also in Berlin. And Raji argues that trade is necessary for prosperity, but it is not always just. We ignore the losers at our peril. And Raji, I would like to begin with you. As we've just heard, the richest 1% of humanity owns more than the rest put together. It's a bewildering figure. It's almost unbearable, but we do bear it. How come? How come we are so indifferent?
I'm not entirely sure I agree that we're indifferent. We hear that statistic, and many, if not most of us,
we live with these shocking realities.
We do live with these shocking realities. And we're indifferent to the extent that we're clearly not doing enough to do something about them. The question really is not that people in general are indifferent, but that the people that are in power in terms of policy making are not doing necessarily the right types of things in order to rectify that imbalance. And
Posener, just to take another figure similar to the one I just quoted, 8 men own the same wealth as the 3.6 billion people who make up the poorest half of humanity. Are we a complacent species?
No, we're not. Look, you in your introductory movie clip, you showed people in Bangladesh, seamstresses and so on. I'm wearing a suit I bought at Primark for 50 euros. It was probably, I didn't look, made in Bangladesh. And so I'm doing my bit, actually, to help development, because Bangladesh is a huge success story. I don't understand why this should be portrayed as something terrible. 90% of Bangladesh's foreign income is earned by exporting T-shirts and suits and what have you to America and the European Union. And these people are in work, they can feed their children. Being in a certain, if you will, food chain from the rich world, many European companies are beginning to look at working conditions and so on. Now, if you go to the Congo, which also has a huge population of people on virtually no income, they'd be happy to be able to produce T-shirts for Europe or the United States. Go to almost anywhere in the world. I repeat, Bangladesh is a success story. This is what we need to repeat around the world instead of pointing our finger at the fact that a seamstress earns too little. At least she's earning.
Mekonnen Mesghena, what do you say to all that? All is well, says Alan Posener.
I'm not saying all is well. I'm saying it's better in Bangladesh than it is in 4/5 of the developing world.
Well, I do boycott companies who produce for very cheap. One of those companies is which Alan mentioned. I'm not sure whether we do a good service to those people who work at a wage of $2 to $3 a day. And we have here prices. We have cheap prices because we exploit people in certain areas. And that's not the only thing. The other thing is we also export, because of subsidies, especially in the agriculture, much cheaper to those countries. So other people lose their existences because of the subsidies we do here in the US and in Europe. So producing cheap, we benefit a lot than the people there. So, I mean, Bangladesh is one of those shocking examples.
You're shaking your head, Alan.
The point is that Congo, except for diamonds, Nigeria, except for oil, all these countries in Kenya, except for cut flowers, they're not producing manufactured goods. They're producing raw commodities which are then get into the hands of corrupt leaders. Now, I'm not playing down the bad conditions of people in Bangladesh. What I'm saying, at least they are part of the world market. At least we know about what they're doing because our firms are producing there. At least they are producing things. It's wrong to point a finger at Bangladesh. We should be pointing the finger at the Congo, at Nigeria, at Ghana, at Eritrea, because these people have, or to us in relation to these, or Yemen, these people have nothing. And we're taking the wrong attitude. And by the way, Bangladesh exports to Europe without there's no tariffs. It's zero tariff. They can export. This is one reason why it's so cheap.
I think there is something to be said for, squaring these differences here in the sense that, Alan, I completely agree with you. The fact that there is demand for Bangladeshi laborers is what allows many of these poor people that we saw in the clip earlier to earn a living in the first place. And I don't mean to point the finger at you, Mekonnen, in that respect, but I think it's a little precious sometimes when people have I'm going to say overly moral stance when it comes to labor standards in developing countries, because we don't think hard enough about the counterfactual question. What would these people be doing if they weren't working in these factories? That being said, are the labor standards there in many of these factories in Bangladesh? I mean, Rana Plaza is probably the example that we think about most dramatically in recent memory. Are these conditions acceptable? You said earlier about, are we turning a blind eye to this? And I think, yes, we are, because with all due respect, Alan, we get our cheap suits from there. So what role then, you say that you boycott Primark, what role can we play as consumers? I think that if we could somehow coordinate, and this is where, my point earlier about policymakers or people making decisions, making coordinated, meaningful decisions, if we could all decide that we will not tolerate low wages in all developing countries. So it's really a coordination failure. In all developing countries, then we will continue to have low labor standards in one place, and we boycott clothes from Bangladesh, they shut the factories down, it'll move somewhere else because there's no real coordination in terms of labor standards, for instance.
The European Union has several programs coordinating with Bangladesh. Bangladesh not only has a preferential tariff agreement with the European Union, which means that they can sell us this stuff without any tariff, which is one of the reasons why it's not so cheap. It's not just cheap labor. The second thing is we have these agreements with the controllers in Bangladesh who look at work conditions.
Yeah, but we know enforcement is a huge issue.
Of course,
right?
enforcement, and I'm all for enforcement. Now, instead of putting the onus on the individual, say boycott this and that country with the results, or being utopian, saying why doesn't everyone earn as much as I do, which is not going to happen. Yeah. I think the European Union is doing a very good job. Could it be better? Certainly. But we're doing things, and it's not publicized enough. We have representatives in Bangladesh looking at working conditions.
Yes, true. But my point is not boycott Bangladesh, boycott those companies who have undermining conditions for workers. There's a difference. And everything which has been enforced during the last couple of years is the result of pressure of consumers. Right. Because we found out how the products has been produced there, under which conditions and which prices mostly children and women pay for that. So we can have here cheaper clothes. So I think this is the result, and that's what I expect also from the responsibility for what we get cheap here we should also bear responsibility to have better working conditions in those countries.
There's a huge danger in advocating things like boycotts when it comes to production. I mean, let's stick with the textiles example in developing countries. We know, for instance, when there have been such actions in the past, what happens is that many of the most vulnerable people, women and children, move from the tradable section, so the export sector of the economy, to the non-traded sector. So rather than making whatever, footballs or T-shirts, they move into things like, an extreme example is prostitution or the sex trade. So I think that's really, I'm not in favour of that.
Well, just one second before we proceed. We're talking about one example for how the global trade works. We're talking about the example of the textiles industry, which produces the fashions that we all, including Alan, wear. And it is shocking to note, however, Alan, that the CEO of one of the top fashion brands earns more in a week than a Bangladeshi seamstress in a lifetime. Let's have a look at the pictures first and then talk.
These images shook the world. In April 2013, over 1,100 people died when the Rana Plaza collapsed in Bangladesh. The disaster had many causes, such as shoddy materials and disregard for human life. Protests did bring some improvements in working conditions, but the underlying exploitation is the same. Virtually no strong unions exist here to represent the workers' interests. Responsibility is often passed on to local subcontractors. Production gets too costly, and buyers will simply go elsewhere. The basic resource in this case was cheap labour. Starvation wages never change, and to block the price of products. The lion's share of profits go to the producers and distributors, and directly to the customers who screenshot T-shirts for €3 apiece. So how can fair, just working conditions be achieved globally?
How ethical or unethical is cheap? We've made a cult out of cheap. We've made an ideology out of cheap. We've made it a global measure.
No, we haven't. Look, Adam Smith and Ricardo, the founders of modern economic theory, they developed the theory of comparative advantage. So if you enter into a market, you have to have something other people don't have, right? Now, if it happens, it's not just cheap labor in Bangladesh, because these people are working, you saw them, they were working with Japanese or Chinese sewing machines in factories that were built with concrete and so on. This is not high tech, this isn't Silicon Valley, but it is not just cheap labor. What they have is they have cheap labor, they have access to ports, they obviously have an organized distribution network, and so on and so on. So this is quite a complex issue, and Bangladesh has developed itself. Just like, look, on the other hand, here, this phone was assembled and the parts are made in China. It's just designed in the United States. Okay, Apple makes the big profit on it, but, you know, this has... China, through stuff like this, has managed to lift millions of people out of poverty. Now, should I just sit back and say it's great? No. In China, these people don't have any rights. It's a communist dictatorship. In Bangladesh, we heard they don't have unions. Well, let's fight for Chinese people to have the right to organize in unions. Let's support the unionization of labor in Bangladesh. But for goodness sake, let's see that this is the way the world develops. This is the way Europe developed. Back 150 years ago, Britain was producing cotton stuff for the world like Bangladesh is now. That's changed. I'm glad that it's not being produced in Lancashire anymore. It's being produced in Bangladesh. And just as the British formed trade unions, the workers, and lifted themselves out of poverty, so I would support anyone who says, I'm organising Bangladeshi women. Of course, that's the way to do it.
Mm-hmm. Mekonnen, do you have any further thoughts on mechanisms for redistribution of income?
Well, I mean, globalization, I don't have any problem with globalization because it creates jobs and, of course, it destroys jobs on other places. I mean, it's a tricky issue because when you build somewhere jobs, you may lose somewhere else. And especially for Europeans, it's a big issue, you know, like going out and finding cheap labor. However, my issue is how do you guarantee standards where people have the opportunity for social mobility, for example, so they can send their children to schools, so they can have a proper health care, etc., etc. So if we create jobs somewhere else, and it's only for our benefit, it doesn't benefit people, while we offshore jobs or companies, I don't see any sense in that issue, unless we extend the poverty in those countries. And the other thing is we are talking a lot about exports, but we should also tackle the issue of overflooding with imports, sending cheap foods, for example, which has been subsidized here. So when we create jobs, we also destroy jobs over there. The recent research in Mexico is that for every 1.5 million food imports into Mexico, 30 farmers lose their jobs and migrate to the US. So we also need to tackle not only their export, but also our import or our export to those countries, also destroy the local markets.
I think that, the point that you made about, I'm an economist, right? So about trade leading to improved efficiency is a very, very important one. And this is what motivated the quote that we began with. I mean, no country has become middle income or high income in the modern age without trade. Okay, so that is a necessary condition. But of course, just because it's efficient doesn't mean it's just in that context, because you're going to be, as you pointed out, there are going to be winners and there are going to be losers. So I disagree with your statement that we open up trade and this leads to impoverishment in the terms of the size of the pie. The size of the pie is bigger. The question is how that pie is being distributed. And it would be folly to ignore that distribution within these countries. So to say, oh, well, these people aren't that well off, they're better off than they used to be, in some ways that's not necessarily going to be good enough in order to sustain.
Never is. I agree. Never is.
As a development economist, what is your opinion on the following question? What leads to greater equality in global markets, regulating markets or freeing markets up?
What leads to, I don't know entirely what you mean by inequality in global markets.
Fairer chances, fairer opportunities for producers and manufacturers in the poorer south of the world?
For me, without doubt, opening up. And the simple reason is that when you had, and some economies still are that way, but let me take the case of India. It's probably easiest to exemplify this through a particular country. So in India, until about 1991, India was a fairly closed economy. Okay, so then the question you ask yourself is, okay, in this closed economy, how do you decide who produces what in terms of exports, or even domestically in terms of the banking sector, for instance, was highly regulated? And the answer is the old institution. It was called the license Raj. Okay, so who got to decide who got to become a big producer of TVs or cars or whatever else? It was whoever the government happened to give a license to produce that. Is that an equal world? Absolutely not. It's a world in which you hand out favors to your buddies. For me, that's incredibly, incredibly unequal.
And if you look at Africa, for instance, I think 33 countries in Africa have relations with the EU where they can export zero tariff. We extend to them most preferred nation status. The problem is not tariffs of Europe against Africa. The problem is tariffs within Africa. There are neighboring countries like, for instance, Ethiopia and Eritrea, which until about a month ago didn't do any trade with each other. And Ethiopia, being landlocked, couldn't get to the ports in Eritrea. To this day, they can't get into Somalia and so on. This is the big problem. It's not us. How many landlocked countries in Africa can't get to the sea because there's a border with corrupt custom officials not only taking the tariffs which the government imposes, but they're cut. I mean, these are big problems that we can't solve for Africa. All we can do is say, look, come on, we're allowing you to import to us. Why don't you trade more with yourselves?
Let me take issue a little bit with your claim there, because you make Europe seem like this knight in shining armor here, right? That it has
compared
free trade
to most people, we are.
It's not a relative thing, though. I mean, let me pick up on a point that Mekonnen mentioned earlier, which was agricultural tariffs, okay, or agricultural subsidies, better
Different.
yet.
Yeah.
Not quite, not entirely, okay? So if we're talking about leaving all the, providing all these opportunities for trade and acting as if Europe is the saint here, then we have to begin to talk about agricultural.
$59 million subsidies in 2018.
Well, in terms of in the EU budget, agricultural subsidies comprise 38% of the EU budget. This is for a population that's under 5% of the EU population. And this is, if you're talking about, the point you mentioned earlier, that trade is, good for efficiency, comparative advantage, then if, African countries have a comparative advantage in anything, agriculture is a big one. And as long as you have these incredibly unequal subsidies when it comes to agriculture, it's not.
Okay,
well, come on. The first thing is the EU budget is really, really small. It's not the budget of all the EU countries. The second thing is the thing where I'm against any subsidy, right? Anywhere in the world, especially in Europe. But the stuff we're subsidizing is basically maize to make ethanol to put in our cars. Tanks. I think that's awful too, but it's not harming Africa. We're not subsidizing cotton growing, which is harming Egypt. Or the Sudan. We're not subsidizing cocoa beans, which might be, we're not even subsidizing the production of flowers. Kenya, if you buy a bunch of flowers, they're probably grown in Kenya, and they're imported here with zero tariff. So come on, we're not knights in shining armor. We're not the devils we're sometimes portrayed about by corrupt leaders in third world countries who want to blame us for their own woes.
Okay. Poverty and inequality, whatever is the reason for them, lead many people to leave their homes and their countries seeking a better life, and what could be more understandable? The result, though, is that tens of millions of migrants are on the move.
This scenario is repeated around the world. People on the move, moving to find a better life. Families joining their plan heading to the United States once they do. They know what awaits them. US President Trump has deployed thousands of troops on the border as a deterrent.
Next question from Mekonnen. We don't have much time. It was always going to be the problem of 26 minutes. Yeah. Mekonnen. Mekonnen, you are the expert here. What good is the agreement?
Well, it can only create a consensus how to manage and deal with migration. I mean, we don't have a global government which is going to implement or to enforce any kind of law. The only thing is, what is our understanding of migration? How do we understand migration? How do we create opportunities for people living somewhere? Because our opportunities are determined by the place where we are born in or live in. So how can we create...
That's the point.
So what is understanding of states, how they can cooperate
It is
together?
a pact for migration. That seems to suggest that migration is a good thing. Is migration always a good thing?
Migration, if it is forced migration, it's not a good thing. If it is a voluntary migration, it is a good thing. So we'll never be able to stop migration. But can we reduce forced migration, which has been caused by environment disasters, by war, by authoritarian governments or bad governance, and of course, poverty.
Raji, can you give me a definition of economic justice for the global economy?
You know what? Economic justice is a bit of an oxymoron, right? Economists are very good at talking about efficiency.
That's very interesting to hear an economist actually saying it's live and on air.
I don't think I'm saying anything controversial to economists here. Economists, I mean, if you talk to an economist, they're very clear that economics talks about efficiency, it doesn't, neoclassical economics, okay, let me be clear, there are other, other fields of economics as well, but the core of traditional economics is one about efficiency. It doesn't say anything about distribution, and justice is a question of distribution and not a question of efficiency.
So we have been talking about how just or unjust the global economy is, Alan, in a nutshell.
Look, you saw these pictures of our border. The point is that this pact for migration is not about us. It's about, for instance, Saudi Arabia, where 80% of the population are migrants. The Gulf states, 90% of the population are migrants. They're doing all the work while the sheikhs are sitting back and smoking their shishas. It's to protect them primarily that we need this compact for migration. People if you work in Saudi Arabia, they take away your passport, even if it's you doing high-class work for the Saudi government. We should stop pouring ashes on our head and really point the finger at the people who are really exploiting other people in this world.
OK, thanks very much for that, Alan. Thanks to you too as well for joining me here today on Quadriga. How unjust is the global economy? I hope we've given you plenty of food for thought. Bye-bye and tschüss.